welcome Percy Thompson, a senior at Agnes College.
Welcome, everyone, to the second keynote session of the Women's Global Leadership Conference, Engaging Leaders. During this session, we have the privilege to hear from Tara Houska of Cushioning First Nation Anishinaabe. Tara is a tribal attorney, the founder of GNU Collective, and a former advisor on Native American affairs to Bernie Sanders. In the past years, Tara has spent 6 months on the front lines fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline and is currently engaged in the movement to defund fossil fuels and a years-long struggle against Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline. She is a co-founder of Not Your Mascots, a group committed to positive representation of Native peoples. Some of Tara's past accolades include being a TED speaker, a 2017 Harvard Public Interested Keynote, receiving the Awesome Women Award from Melinda Gates, the 2021 American Climate Leadership Award, a 2019 Rachel's Network Catalyst Award, and being featured in Women, A Century of Change by National Geographic. Tara has also written for the women's-led climate anthology, All We Can Save, the New York Times, CNN, The Guardian, Vogue, and Indian Country Today. Tara currently lives in a pipeline resistance camp in northern Minnesota. Introducing this phenomenal woman is yet another phenomenal woman, Rose Scott. Rose is an award-winning journalist and host of the midday news program Closer Look, featured on Atlanta's NPR station 90.1 FM. During Rose's time as a co-host and now host, she has interviewed a range of people from foreign heads of state to civic and social leaders, as well as discuss a variety of topics from affordable housing, domestic violence, and HIV/AIDS to criminal justice reform, Georgia's death penalty, and the sex trafficking of minors in Atlanta. Rose has received several awards during her time as a journalist, including a Southeast Regional Emmy Award, an Edward R. Monroe Award, Atlanta Association of Black Journalists Award, and numerous Georgia Association of Broadcasters Awards. As a senior and burgeoning activist myself, I am psyched to introduce Tara Houska and Rose Scott.
Thank you all, and I hope you all can hear me. If you all can hear me, I guess make some noise. It's like a DJ. Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us virtually, that is. It is a pleasure to be a part of this Women in Climate Justice Conference at Agnes College, although I'm a few miles away. As you can see, I am still here in our studios at WABE in Atlanta. You know, these last 19 months, due to the pandemic, our studios have been a little less busy, but nevertheless, the conversations have continued, and many about, well, the pandemic, politics, protests, and at the core of all of this, people. And while the recent news that perhaps by next March we will have finally made it past this Delta surge, a metric that includes a drop from about 140,000 infections on a daily basis to 9,000 a day by March. That may not sound like good news, but according to the health experts, that is welcome news. And through all this, all those disparities, inequities, and social economic gaps that the pandemic amplified and highlighted, which should have been apparent before, but that's another story, well, they will continue when we're, quote, through this, whatever that means. And so the question is, how do we then take these moments that we're in with all these disparities and inequities, and we transform them into actionable outcomes? And that's a big part of my conversation today with Tara, and I am so excited because we're going to talk about this through an environmental lens with an examination of perseverance, grit, and leadership for and by women. So Tara, it's a pleasure. I am so excited that you are with me. I can't see you yet, but I know you're with me.
I can see you just fine.
How you doing, sister?
I'm inside of a vehicle because it's so windy today. I can't be outside. At least for this. Sorry, there was too much feedback.
It's all right. Let's begin, Tara, with this moment, because I've been asking a lot of folks to reflect on where we are in this moment as a nation since last March, pandemic, protests, this political season. Uh, what's your take on all this? And in the last 19 months?
So I think Mother Nature showed us that she can shut down the whole world if she chooses, that human beings are subject to nature, no matter how much we try to convince ourselves that we aren't, that our economies and our livelihoods and the way that we've chosen to engage with each other and with nature is somehow above all of that. And it's not. I don't know if the lesson that she gave us is really sticking as well as it should. It seems like no matter what we see right in front of us, which is, thousands of people walking on from this world, the disparities that were very, very apparent through which communities were impacted the worst by the pandemic. Those are the same communities impacted the worst by climate crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, also seeing, the wildfires of the West reaching places that they never reached, and the floods on the East, and the hurricanes, and even here where I'm calling you from northern Minnesota, first time really seeing wildfires and a drought that has our rivers empty and all of that. But even with all of that, we still continue on with the status quo and convince ourselves that everything is going to go back to normal.
Yeah, whatever normal is. And even earlier this year with that report that was released by the United Nations on global climate change, and, the research was clear. It revealed, look, human behavior is directly responsible for the rate of climate change. Now, I don't know why it took 14,000 reports and 234 scientists for people to be alarmed when this report came out earlier this year. But we've known this for a long time, that human behavior is directly responsible. But then here's the question, and as we get into your work and get further into this conversation, why are we still having this conversation about our human behavior and how it's responsible for the rate of climate change?
One, I think there is a real refusal at some level or another to let go of the way of life that we've become accustomed to, specifically in so-called westernized societies. We know that our life comes at a huge cost to others. We know that it comes to a cost to the environment and a cost to human hands. The things that we have and the possessions that we are basically told to consume from the moment we're born come at a huge cost, right? And that's part of it. I think there's also a recognition that there is huge climate grief happening and an inability to grapple with something that is so large and is so existential. How do we look at the science and not just grow completely paralyzed by that grief? And how do we engage, knowing that we have gone past a certain point that the scientists have warned us so many times, not just in this IPCC report, but in the many reports before that, and the years before that, and the decades before that, let alone what nature has been telling us all along. And that's been also through the indigenous peoples of the world who are still deeply connected. We've been telling people these things for a long time, but it's how do we listen, and then what do we do about it?
Absolutely. Look, folks don't want to listen to science as it relates to vaccines, so we shouldn't be surprised,
Yeah.
huh? That's the great thing about having this conversation, because I can step a little bit outside of being a journalist and give my personal opinion about some things. But you know what you have said, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to take this further for our audience, because you have said, look, indigenous peoples are impacted first and worse by climate change. And I want you to really drive that message home for our audience right now. I'm gonna let you take it from here and give you some moments to offer some reflection for them.
We are on the front lines of climate crisis. I think in the last year, especially in the last few years, it's started to show up in so-called North America in a larger way, and more folks have become kind of aware of this problem. But it's Black and brown bodies in the global South that have been experiencing climate crisis, that have been subjected to roads that are melting, to seas that are rising, to places that hold their ancestors that are now underwater and lost forever. But it's always somewhere else, right? Just like the goods that we consume are from somewhere else, and it's someone else's quality of life that can be that way, but not ours, right? It's someone else is experiencing these hurricanes and it killed 2 million people, but it's not us. We're different somehow. And those people have been Black and Indigenous people everywhere in the globe. And when it comes to Indigenous people specifically, like even here in North America, we're some of the first climate change refugees. The people that are in the bayou, the Indigenous people there, the Indigenous people that are up in Alaska, already seeing their homes lost to rising seas. We're the people that know what is happening at a really intimate level because we're still connected deeply. Mm-hmm. The land holds our medicines. It holds our culture. Like here in Minnesota, where I've been fighting the Line 3 pipeline, the tar sands pipeline for the last 7 years, it's about the wild rice for me, the Minoman. It's at the heart of our culture and who we are. And it also tells us what's happening with the climate, right? Like it's this grain that's very, very sensitive to water quality. Water quality has been changing even here in a place where there's so much water. This last year, there's a intense drought. I mean, the rivers are dry and empty, and they're still they still did drill 22 rivers with a tar sands pipeline to expand the industry. We know what's happening because we're experiencing it firsthand, and we're also the people trying to defend it.
I want to say this. You have a very cute dog in the background.
Yeah.
You want to go ahead and just introduce, because it's a great snapshot of you talking about land and culture. And then there's this, our humankind best friend on the front lines there with you. You want to go ahead and tell everybody who that is?
Yeah, sure. And his mom was actually born in Red Warrior Camp in the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle. His dad is LaDonna Allard's dog. She was the head of Sacred Stone. And this guy was born over in the Line 3 camp. This is Giza Sumakwa. Just call him Giz. His name is Sun Bear. And he's been a scout dog for years. So
I love it. Well, he can stay right there. Let's back up a little bit and let's talk about your personal journey into all of this. People always ask, and I did an interview with the Agnes Scott College, Leocadia Zach, President Zach, and she asked me about, my origin story and my passion for doing what I do. And it does begin with my childhood. And I imagine for you too, your origin story as an environmental justice warrior. I hope that's something that you appreciate. Tell our audience how this all began for you in this journey.
I think, for a lot of us, it's a childhood calling, right? And to me, I actually grew up in a really small place, outside of a town called National Falls, which is also a really small place. But I grew up in a town of 200 people and didn't really know what was going on out in the world unless I turned on the TV and watched the news, and that really wasn't something I was doing when I was growing up. I grew up in a place that's still the way it's been. It hasn't been ravaged by climate crisis, or it hasn't been ravaged by pipelines and extraction and mines and all the chemicals and like all of that. It's a place that's largely intact. It wasn't until I went out into the world as the first person in my family to go to college and all of that, and one of the few in my entire school, which is very small, to venture out and learn so much about the state of the world, and what was happening, and that people didn't understand where their water came from, and they didn't think about where their food came from, and they weren't hunting in the forest, and they weren't like, I was this backwards kind of like hick, but then the clash of them not understanding the most basic things about where does this all come from, you think about that all the time when you're in a place that's really small like that and isolated. And I guess through the years, I started out doing Indian child welfare when I was in law school, and then moved into just Indigenous sovereignty issues when I was in Capitol Hill. And at the heart of all of it, to me, is the realization and truth that without a habitable planet to live on, we cannot make progress in any sort of justice if we don't have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink and clean soil to grow food. Those are the most basic truths as living beings on this planet.
I'm curious because as you are telling people this story and you're making the connection between the environment, indigenous peoples, you're making this connection also that, this is a civil rights issue as well. You've been making this connection for people, but I'm curious, what kind of responses did you get? Were there some people that said, I really never thought of it that way? And did you give them a side eye and have to take it further?
Yeah, I mean, I engage with all kinds of people in various states of understanding, including like the financiers behind the industry, right? So the people that are wearing the three-piece suits in like the really high-rise building that are looking at me like, who is this person and how do they get here? I have to consult with them, I guess. And then I'm sitting there and reminding them that everything around them is made of the earth, that the concrete in the walls is made of stone, that the glass is made of sand, that their clothes are made of cotton and polymers that have been manipulated from the earth. And sometimes I'll see like a kind of like this moment where you can see someone kind of look at their shoulder or something, you know what I mean? They're like realizing, oh my God. And it's like, yeah, and you are of the earth also.
Right.
No matter how much you try to convince yourself you're above it, you are subject to the earth. And don't we really know that when we see a hurricane destroy an entire community or a tornado wipe out people, or now because of us, we got fire tornadoes, I mean, these are things that we cannot change just by buying our way out of it, right? Like we can't purchase climate safety, we can try to at least address mitigation or try to create protections for certain at-risk communities. But I mean, to really engage with nature, we have to recognize that we're part of nature. And I think that's where a lot of the disconnection lies, is we've completely erased or convinced ourselves that we're not part of the web of life. And that is an absolute human fallacy.
I want to follow up on that because I'm curious to get your thoughts on how we have missed this disconnection as well with our youth. I'm going to be honest with you. And I attended St. Louis public schools in elementary school. I don't remember anything. I don't remember anybody talking about climate change. I'm just going to keep it real with you. I think I really started only reading more about it when I was in college. And in high school, I went to an all-girl Catholic high school. No one talked about climate change. And I'm old.
It's the same. I didn't grow up learning about climate change at all. I think I like maybe vaguely remember in like the late 90s something about global warming. It's just not something that I'd ever heard. But what I will say, and this is kind of like a disconnect, not just between youth and the next generation and like the generations after that, but also between like the rural communities and like the Beltway or something like that, which is just because you're speaking this language of statistical analysis and climate data and all of that, the people who are living with the earth understand the earth very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
And you just have to learn to speak that language, right? Like there's a huge gap between the two. And I think that's where things like the Green New Deal really tried to put a lot of pieces around jobs in it, but it didn't quite reach, and transition into that understanding of, hey, this is really about communities that are deeply entrenched in farming and in agriculture and in all these different extraction, right? Like in communities I'm from, you extract to live. You're either cutting down the trees or you're digging up, minerals, or you're putting a pipeline through your backyard, and that's the way you get a job. But that disconnection between the youth too is, I mean, this fight that I've been part of now is there's been over 800 people arrested. I'd say upwards of 90% of those people are 20, 22, 23 years old. They're very young people because there is no confusion about what is happening. There is no, oh, we have to keep things the same way and nothing can possibly change and you don't understand the economy. It's like the world is changing around us at an incredible pace. And they've known what climate change is since they were like 5 years old. They understand what's happening in very, very real ways.
Well, I do agree. I think this generation is just a little bit more proactive than when I was their age. I'm just going to keep that real. I also want to focus for our audience, Tara, and give a little insight into your work as a tribal attorney And I think people may be surprised to learn that it's different than maybe what we would think in terms of a traditional lawyer or attorney just working here, in Atlanta or wherever, because you specialize in certain laws and governing provisions as it relates to your Native American and Indian tribes. In your work as a tribal attorney, um, what has been the challenges for you?
Well, I think even within tribal lawyerdom, I'm probably a pretty I won't say bizarre, but definitely out there kind of case where I actually live out in the woods and work and train and engage with the resistance to defend the earth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not in a law office. I have running water or electricity. I'm like calling you from a truck because it's so windy outside today. And I can also charge my phone if it starts to die. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the hardest challenges within tribal law is the lack of precedent that occurs in that specific area of law, the confusion that's been through the decades of the Supreme Court and through the judiciary attempting to understand this body of law that they've been shaping with each new case.
Mm-hmm.
One of the instances that comes to mind that's really prominent right now is the Indian Child Welfare Act and the continuing challenges to that. And what's really at the heart of it, which is not about these, so-called poor families having their children ripped away from them when in fact they're Native children that have a right to their tribes, right? Like that's the basis of the Indian Child Welfare Act. But there's a lot of big interests, special interests, like fossil fuels, actually, like Energy Transfer Partners, who's recently joined into one of the ICWA lawsuits that are trying to challenge the heart of federal Indian law itself, trying to say that tribal nations are not tribal nations, that we are not independent sovereigns, that we're being given special rights instead of the reality of the fact that we are the original peoples of these lands, and this country exists because of us, because of the treaties that were signed with us.
When you think about then the fact that you said, you're a little bit different, you're out in the woods and sleeping out there and doing your thing, does that present any other barriers that you might not face if you were in a traditional office or had a different, I guess, way of championing, Native and indigenous peoples, from a legal standpoint, their rights? Is that a challenge to you because you are, as you put it, kind of a outlier in a different way?
Yes and no. I mean, I think it aligns with the values and what I've seen over the years in terms of my own advocacy and where I've viewed there to be efficacy and integrity, which is, the policy shifts and the legislative pushes and the reform approach, specifically when it comes to climate and the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Environmental justice, it's racial justice, it's gender justice, it's all those things mixed in. I just don't see the way that method and that route solely is going to address the climate crisis in the urgent manner it needs to be addressed. It's just not happening fast enough, and there is too much politicization of things that aren't politicized. Water is not political. Water is what we need to drink to be alive. It's that simple. And what I've seen in terms of advocacy and what is heard, when you've got 800 folks that are locking themselves to the machines, that are crawling inside the equipment, all of a sudden you have a national campaign and you have a president that's feeling the pressure of that.
Mm-hmm.
A bunch of petitions and, delivering like a new potential policy or something like that, which all is part of it. I'm not saying that those pieces are not important, but to be a healthy and successful and effective movement, I think that the direct action pieces of it are ones that need to be centered far more than they are. There are Indigenous land defenders all over the globe that are doing the exact same things, and they're oftentimes assassinated or killed for this work because it's impactful.
Well, you mentioned that, and I want to back up for a moment because just a few months ago, I mean, as you stood alongside your other water protectors and the Line 3 pipeline protesters up there in Minnesota, look, you all faced rubber bullets. I think you tweeted mace, pepper balls. You know, this work can be dangerous and this work can be deadly. You've
Absolutely.
alluded to that. You've tweeted about that.
I've experienced that. I
You
mean,
experienced it, yeah.
when your opponent that is focused on nothing but corporate greed and has no plan whatsoever for the future and is literally stealing from future generations, is reacting to the work that you're doing with such egregious and forceful response. I mean, to me, that tells me like what the fear and where the fear really lies, you know, and where the concerns really are, which is civil unrest and the people themselves. Like we talked about at the very beginning, like this is about the people, right?
Mm-hmm.
It always has been about the people. None of these things and these systems and these structures function without the people. You know, the people have to buy in, the people have to be part of this or tacitly not resist or something like that. And so those pieces of advocacy I found to be very, very important. While still using, you know, the litigation and legal background that I have, which has been useful also, you know, when you're in certain situations and somebody's trying to oppress your rights and you maybe have a better understanding of how that actually works.
You know, I want to go back to something that you said a while ago because it's definitely true, you know, considering that often, look, people of color are on the front lines of the climate crisis and at the same time bearing the burden and feeling the most negative impact of all of this. So I'm moving into then allies because you and I both know as women of color, and I said this before and I'm gonna say it again. I need to write a book when woke people fall asleep because people want to be your allies, but then when it comes to actionable outcomes, sometimes folks disappear. And I'm curious as to get your thoughts on, you know, who have been the allies for you all, and what, you know, I've had people ask me, how can I be a better ally? And I hate answering that question. And I shouldn't ask you that, but I'm asking anyway because I'm curious what you're going to say. So who have been the allies for you all?
I would definitely say in this campaign against Lane 3, it's been a really deep honor to witness Black and Indigenous solidarity manifest in a real way. This pipeline is being fought in northern Minnesota, which is the place also in southern Minnesota where George Floyd was murdered in the streets of Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us, including our camp, actually went down and stood where we were told to stand and helped with whatever skills we could bring. You know, like that was just a given that we are standing together, that our liberation is intertwined. And it's been really beautiful to watch that in real time and to see so many Black relatives stand with us. I would say in terms of allyship, you know, it's been a pretty big cross section of folks, with the largest, again, being youth. The young people really understand this is what's at stake. Their literal future is what's at stake. So I've seen many college kids or kids that are dropping out of college that are like, I have to do something. Like this is real, you know, like this is happening and it is real. And it's not just one pipeline. It's not about the fact that it's just one pipeline. It's about the fact that it's a 10% expansion of the tar sands,
Mm-hmm.
that it's the emissions equivalent of 50 coal fire plants, that like we cannot take this out of the atmosphere once it's in. You know, these are irrevocable harms, that it's going through the headwaters of the Mississippi River, where there was just another frack out yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Chemicals spilling into the headwaters of the Mississippi River, like where it starts. It's the only place that it's clean along the whole river, and got chemicals dumping into it now. Those folks have been really powerful. So have like the maybe less traditional kind of like so-called white liberals. You know, it's a pretty interesting scene to be out on a front line and to see a person that you would never expect to be in a front line. The maybe a little bit more, how do I put this? Suburban white liberal alongside the anti-state anarchist that are both united under the front of we need water to live.
Mm-hmm.
It's that simple.
What do you say to people when they say, well, how can I be a better ally in this fight? alongside you, Tara, and everyone else?
I mean, I always am telling people again and again to find their bravery. We're not going to solve climate crisis comfortably. We might not even solve climate crisis. We might be too far past this point, but don't we want to be part of a world where we tried and we did everything we could to build the best world that we could, to be in a place where racial justice and social justice and gender justice and all these different inequities, we're at least attempting to address them in a real way, not in words, but substantively with action. Don't we want to live in a world where we try to save the rivers for our children and we try to protect the forest for our children? Finding your bravery and using your privilege are incredible gifts to give to the land defenders of the world, to the communities, the impacted communities that need your help. Those are real ways to step up and to step out. And I've seen many, many people do it. And it's a beautiful thing to watch. And it's also a really powerful solidarity to build.
Can you understand someone saying, but can we do this? Can we reach those actual outcomes that you just talked about? Can we do this without politics, without politicians? Don't we need support and allies? And you know where I'm going. In Washington, in state legislatures, in local governments.
I would say, I'm a pragmatic person, and that's kind of my approach to activism or whatever it's called. I actually don't consider myself an activist. I think I'm just an active person. And I hope that all of us are active people. We should be active. This is our world and our children are coming into it, right? Don't we want to be active in that world? Yeah, I think there's obviously a reality that the state exists, that the decision makers are currently the Biden administration in this country, or, locally here, it's the Walz administration. It's Trudeau, over in Canada. It's, all these different world leaders, right? So we can't pretend like those places don't exist and that they have enormous influence and effect on real people, everyday people. That said, I think there is so much attention that is just entirely geared at engaging in those familiar, comfortable forms of advocacy, which is, let's get out the vote, let's sign this petition, let's click this link, and let's call our senators, and then we're good. Okay, do all of those things, but then show up for the land itself too. Show up for the community that's calling out for you to get your boots on the ground. Show up for George Floyd. Show up for all of those different communities that need your actual body and your agency, because that's what gets things moving, right? I mean, I don't think there's a better example in decades that I can think of than what happened when you had dozens of cities shutting down because the people were out in the streets saying, no, we're done with watching Black men and Black women being killed by police. Mm-hmm. We went from only those circles, only the racial justice and social justice circles talking about these issues, sharing these clips over and over again and being traumatized by that, to an entire nation talking about it, right? An entire nation being like, oh my God, maybe abolishing the police actually is an idea, that's how quickly that changed. That changed because of direct action. It changed because there was people of all walks of life standing together and saying no.
To that point, then, collaborations across different sectors, whether it's with, and I'm just throwing out organizations, Black Lives Matter or the NAACP, or, organizations with the lens that focus on our Asian American and Pacific Islanders families. You're talking about collaborations coming from all these other sectors coming together. We can learn from that. So you're saying we can learn from what happened last year?
I mean, I think
go ahead.
From that, but also recognize that, when the attention moves away, when the fervor kind of dies a little bit, right? And people start to kind of revert back to how things always were. A lot of times that's where, it's really important to have the infrastructure already there, right? So Black Lives Matter didn't just happen overnight, right? And it wasn't just Black Lives Matter either. It was all the decades and decades of work, civil rights work before that. Mm-hmm. The same thing with environmental justice. It's not like we've just suddenly started protecting our own land, you know, like we've been doing it since time immemorial. But it's what happens when that attention moves away, and where do we ultimately end up? You know, do things start getting like watered down? Does the ask from the community kind of get lost? And I think that's where the movement could do a better job, or at least a more honest job, of not trying to be the systems that we're trying to replace, right? Like we're not trying to reflect oligarchy and top-down strategy, when that's what we're pushing back against, right? We're actually trying to say, no, the communities and like the grassroots, the people should be centered in our decision making.
Well, then let's talk about leadership and all of that too. I've had conversations with different grassroots organizations. Some may have a storied history in this nation, and some may just be, you know, as I call them, the youngins. The young folks are coming up, but they may have a different strategy, Tara, about how to approach an issue. They may have you know, I always say, look, you know, people can talk about the differences in the civil rights movement, you know, the difference with the Black Panther Party and Dr. King's message and Malcolm X's message. Because at the end of the day, everyone wanted the same outcome. And I think we're still experiencing that with a different generation. What is your advice to leadership, to the different leaders in this movement, about putting aside egos? Because let's be really clear, they're getting away. You know, they're getting away. You know, they're getting away.
Yes.
What is your message about leaders in this movement that you're a part of, and making sure that everyone's on the same page and has this, if you even have a different strategy, but you all want the same actionable outcome?
Well,
you know, ineffective leadership can kill a movement. You know that.
No, and I mean, that's a big part of it though, too, that I've seen again and again, which is when the outcome and the intent gets lost, right? Where like the intent is we're going to protect the rivers, and then it suddenly becomes, well, no, this is the way we do it, and this is how we do it. And then where's the funding mechanism behind it, and what's the strategy, and how are we going to benefit from, you know, it starts to get really confused.
Yeah.
And that's just in this one little microcosm of this particular like or campaign. You know, you start to see like people lose focus. And I think a part of leadership is ensuring that the intention, that the outcome is always clear, that whatever it is that you're seeking to do, that you do not lose focus of that and get caught up in a lot of the things that you were just mentioning, like ego and, you know, how is this going to benefit me and, you know, and maybe us, like our little group or something like that. And then you start seeing this fractionation happen, which the opponent loves, right? Like that's where the Enbridge of the world, or, you know, the folks who want to keep these systems of inequality and siloing very, very strong, is like, oh yeah, this is like, let's make sure this community stays nice and fractionated, because then it's like everyone's fighting with each other when they're actually all looking for the same outcome.
Have you had to deal with that, Tara?
Absolutely.
How did you deal with it?
I mean, I think at least the approach I've always had is to not engage with the undermining of others by following principles of diversity of tactics. And even if I personally don't agree with someone else's, you know, maybe they're going to devote all of their energy towards electoral politics, you know, 100%. And I'm like, okay, well, I wouldn't do that, but, you know, more power to you. By not allowing myself to get caught up in that, and also by letting the actions really speak for themselves. So I think there's a lot of pressure when you are grappling with such large issues, whether it's, you know, like the racial justice or social justice or environmental justice. These are really big issues and questions that we are attempting to address, right? Or like missing and murdered Indigenous women, you know, the disparity of violence between Black bodies and non-Black, like all of that is so sensitive. And recognizing that, you know, to give space for people to have those diversity of tactics, and to really try to remain focused on what are the actions that you're taking to the benefit of that issue. Not how does it benefit you, but how does it actually benefit that issue? Whether it's, the action that we took today, shut down the pipeline's construction like for the next couple days. And maybe the continued actions have now reached this tipping point of the president hearing about it, and letting those acts really speak rather than all the words that can get really, I think, messy at times.
Are you seeing a lot more women in the movement, in the climate justice movement?
I mean, I think that women have always been there, just like they are in every single movement. And what I'm seeing is, rather than having movements that are centered around typically kind of like more patriarch type figures that reference women a lot, but oftentimes are the ones that are out there holding the mics, and the women are the ones that are doing all the things. It seems like there's a balancing out that's happening of women speaking for themselves, and of our camp is actually GNU Collective is based in women leadership and also in two-spirit leadership. Mm-hmm. So those balanced voices that we need to hear from. We've heard a lot of the same voices for a long time. Mm-hmm. It's time to make space and hear from these voices that have a different perspective.
I want to talk about moving to mental health for a moment in this work. Whenever I do these social justice or racial justice or anti-racism workshops and talks, and people get inspired, and they're like, I'm going to go out and do this. And I'm like, look, you're not going to change somebody's mind by going to the local Kroger and standing up for a person of color that you think is being mistreated. John Lewis did this work for a half century.
Yep.
This work is exhausting. How do you balance that for you in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting here at the conclusion, it looks like, of a 7-year fight, 7 years of my life, fighting this single project and facing well over a dozen charges personally, and hundreds and hundreds of other people who are facing the same. And even though they were torturing us and using pain compliance and shooting at us and doing all these things, at the end of the day, the Democrats said nothing and the pipeline got built. Mm-hmm. And it crushes your heart for sure. And it feels like, we gave it everything. Now what? How do we keep going? And that was the fight at Dakota Access too. Everyone heard about, Standing Rock and all of that and thought it was really beautiful. At the end of the day, that pipeline got built. After everyone left and the attention was gone, it got built. So what do we do when we're up against these types of opponents and we're trying to shift an entire narrative of centering environmental justice, of centering, critical race theory and all of that? How do we move into that and not lose hope during the process? I think there's a lot to be said for recognizing and seeing how many lives you've touched and how many people have been impacted, and the ripples that you don't even know you've caused by the movement that you're part of. The hearts that you might have reached, the minds that you didn't even know were watching, and maybe that'll manifest in a different way in their lives. Maybe they're going to become a warrior out there, or maybe they're going to become a politician, or maybe they're going to become a teacher, or they're going to become a person that walks with empathy with everyone around them. Empathy is a huge part of society that's so lacking. We are so focused on individualism and surviving, and that empathy is oftentimes kind of relegated to weakness. And that, again, is like, I think, the centering of women and other forms of leadership.
So how do you move beyond, and this is the best word that I can think of, how do you then move beyond if you feel like you've been defeated? You said those pipelines got built anyway. Someone listening, watching says, well, okay, but then you go on to the next, and maybe you've been defeated. What's the metric that you use then for saying, well, maybe we had an effective victory in that war.
Yeah, right. Like that's like the NGO model, like all the victories, like the constant post of a victory.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get this so cerebral.
Yeah, no, I mean it's all good, and I think there's also, when you are in movement, sometimes it's really hard to allow yourself room to have some victories when you want the thing. Like the thing is your pipeline packs up and goes home, and you don't destroy our people's treaty territory. You don't continue cultural genocide. That the president of the United States actually respects Indigenous sovereignty for once, and there's a different outcome. That we put a ban on all new fossil fuel infrastructure, that we engage in community justice oriented, like actual substantive change, right? And not just the same old thing again and again. That said, I mean, I think there are victories in the sense of you've not only affected the people that have been touched by your individual campaign and by your individual effort. And I mean individual, I guess, like that one stream, not me as a person, but like this collective of folks that all did this work and impacted all these lives. Not only was it that, but you also have transcended and showed a bunch of people, how do you be effective? How do you reach, and how do you shift? And then how do you teach others to live life in a different way? And those are victories, right? Like those are real victories, and those are real moments where you're doing all of that. And then for me, I guess when I'm out in the territory itself, and I'm with the water, and I'm with the trees, and I'm with the animals, and all of that, and I think about the fact that they saw all that too, and they saw us giving everything we had for them, because it wasn't just for us, it was for them, and they feel that and try to offer their healing. When we're in those spaces, they're still trying to help us and pity us.
Who do you turn to when you are down? And I imagine you have some down moments. Maybe you don't. I have down moments. I have to have my village, my tribe, my sisters.
Yeah, I mean, I spend time with the littles. They always cheer me up. That's who all of this work is really for me, is that and the rice. I get to be out in the rice, and this year was really hard because of the drought. A lot of the lakes were empty or drained. Enbridge got to take out 5 billion gallons of water from our watershed, even though it was a full-on drought up here. Literally draining rivers to put a tar sands pipeline through. So there's not really been a lot of, I guess, respite in those places that I normally would. But there's respite in ceremony and in family. There's going to these places that mean so much to us, spending time with where ancestors' footsteps sit and their hearts sit. Those are ways to reframe as this little link in a chain, and remembering that your life is so small and just this flash, and don't take yourself too seriously.
I call on the ancestors as well. Trust me on that. Before we get to some of the questions from the audience, where do you hope we are in maybe, well, here's a good metric, because it's the Biden administration, in 4 years in terms of policy and legislation in this nation? We know globally it takes a whole lot of different nations to be on one accord, so to speak. But as it relates to, we'll say North America and obviously United States, where do you hope we are 4 years from now as it relates to climate change?
In 4 years?
Yeah.
When another report comes out with another doom message, and we still,
right.
I mean, yeah, I just said, and we still haven't done that much. I hope in 4 years people are angry enough to force change. I hope within 2 years people are pissed off enough and recognize that the pipelines are still being built. MVP is still being built. Line 3 got built. Dakota Access Pipeline is still flowing illegally. They're still expanding the fossil fuel industry all over. There's been more oil leases approved in the last few months under Biden than there was under Trump in the last year. So, I hope people get pissed off enough about that they are demanding change. That just because you cancel, the Pebble mine in Alaska, but you're still drilling in other places across the tundra, that's not addressing climate crisis. Just because you cancel Keystone XL and you allow through Line 3, those are the same tar sands, same emissions. That isn't addressing climate crisis. You can't mitigate climate crisis. So I hope that people really open their eyes and don't feel powerless to make change. That they don't feel like there's nothing they can do, that it's always going to happen. It's just some new politician making new promises in the office. If we allow through and continue to be passive participants in this, we're not going to have a world for our children. And I hope people are out in the streets, and I hope people are out on the land. People kind of find their way back to the land, and also in their own individual hearts reconnect that umbilicus to their mother.
Absolutely. I believe we're going to take some questions from the audience. Now, how are we going to do that? I'm not sure, but we're going to do it.
Hello, I'll start asking questions on behalf of our virtual audience. The first one comes from L. Julian Kennery, and it's a two-part question. First, how do we accelerate the elevation of women into new roles and creating them for sustainable development and regenerative systems? And related to that, the second part is, how do we address the reality that more women were killed this and last year standing up for land protection and clean air? And an example would be recently, sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, but Miss Fikile into Shangasi in South Africa, who have been standing up for alternatives to the local transnational coal industry.
Yeah, they love to target women, right? We're the backbones of these spaces. And I know that by going after women, you're really going after the heart of a people. When it comes to how do we get women into these positions of leadership or their voices brought to a higher platform, I personally think there's a lot to be said to women working together, just like this, that we have been kind of in our own cycle of growth as women and kind of viewing each other maybe as competition, or I suffered a lot, so now you have to suffer a lot, and not really lifting each other up and standing with each other in a real way. I think this last 3 years of collective that I was part of and founded and helped build, it was so strongly women. There's very, very few quote unquote cis men. And instead it was a bunch of women and two-spirits and queer folks and young folks learning how to support each other in a real way and how to lift each other up and not engaging in patterns of ego and selfishness. It was powerful to see that happen. And I think these networks of women that do form, and really trying your best to do that and to lean on each other is really important to succeeding together. Because then you're standing together, not just by yourself.
Hi. Ooh, that's loud.
My name is Percy, and my question, well, earlier on you stated that achieving climate justice won't be comfortable. One, the climate is changing enough that we can't continue consuming as much as we can, are anyway, and eventually it will attack the 1% as much as it is marginalized communities and the 99% and everything else like that. But how do we approach people where they are currently? Because not everyone's willing to get out of their comfort zones immediately, as well as like maintaining their attention. Because science, or scientists in the beginning, they attempted to fearmonger, I guess, quote unquote, by stating this is what's going to happen to the earth, blah, 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 blah. And it didn't really catch people's attention and have the effect that they thought. And so what's the best approach?
Yeah, and I mean, I think the environment has actually been one of our biggest allies in struggle by showing people this is what's happening. You know, like I don't need to sit here and read you some statistical analysis or some data sheet that tells you about line 3 is 780,000 barrels a day, but tar sands, blah, blah, blah. It's all the emissions are this much. And you can look at your backyard and see it, right? Like this summer, like the entire state was covered with wildfire smoke and the sun was red. You know, like it's not scare tactics anymore. It's here right in front of us. Right. And so like meeting people where they're at, I think I'm kind of I don't know. I have a little bit of a different opinion on that, which is I think the climate movement itself focuses so heavily on recruitment and focuses so heavily on onboarding people when there are millions of people who are already engaged and that already know climate crisis is happening, that already know climate crisis is here, that it doesn't fit into like this whole let's build a giant listserv, which also has a lot to do with donations. Let's not build this giant network of people who may or may not really engage. You know, I think there's a lot to be done with for the people that are already here. Where are we guiding people and where are we pushing people in leadership? You know, where are we trying to shift the energy towards? Are we really trying to say like, you know, you're here in this, maybe you've signed a petition, you've done this, and you've shown up at a governor's office. What's next for you? And also like, what's next for your friends? You know, like, have you talked to your friends? Have you talked to your mother? Have you talked to your kids? Have you talked to, you know, like all those things that I think that are really about moving with the people that we already have, because we have more than enough people that care about climate. And that also includes people in the global south, includes human rights components, and that includes all those pieces that are so intersectional, right? Like that also with tribal justice, that has to do with, you got indigenous people, 5% of the population holding 80% of the biodiversity, yet we oftentimes have almost no rights when it comes to our land, or very minimal ad hoc type of rights that get scraped away. There's a really smart way to get involved with like saving ourselves, which is, you know, strengthen tribal sovereignty, strengthen indigenous sovereignty, try to help like these places and spaces where people are already experiencing climate crisis and hold a huge stake in our own survival as a total globe, right? Like I think there's a way to be effective and smart and not just always focusing on like we got to build our listserv and make it more. I think most folks know that climate change is happening that are already involved in the movement.
Thank you.
Hi, hopefully everyone can hear me. So my question is, you've talked a lot about the state as an entity, and I think that a lot of times there is a split, like a real split between those of us that might be on the more radical side and those people like abolition versus reform. So I think when coming together, how do we find the compromise between those two, and how do we act together as groups that might have like fundamentally different beliefs in what the world should look like?
Yeah, that's kind of where I sit, because I'm like a lawyer, but I also live in the woods. Like I've done like electoral votes and like just hosted the squad out in our camp, right? Like it's definitely worlds collide kind of situation, right? When you've got Ilhan and Rashida and Ayana and Corey all sitting there in the woods with a bunch of folks who are a range of land like, I mean, those are worlds collide situations, right? And they're like, this is what you spend half your day doing, right? I think there is like the unifier of every single one of us needs clean air to drink, or clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and clean soil to grow food. Like those are basic truths that we can all unify under. And I think that's where, again, like the question earlier about when we have these different approaches and different leaders start fighting about the movement and are fighting each other and all that, diversity of tactics is not a it shouldn't be viewed as a negative thing. You know, it's actually a really healthy thing, right? Like we can't, there's not one silver bullet to fix climate crisis. There's not one silver bullet to fix racial injustice. You know, it manifests in so many different ways, right? It can manifest structurally, it can manifest in education, in healthcare, in, you know, so many different aspects of human life. But finding those intersections of like, where do you and I align? We align around the water. We align around the earth. We align around empathy for human beings and care for each other. Even if your liberal reform idea doesn't match up with the state needs to go, there's still those unifiers of we're humans in this together and we're trying to create a better world. And to not be so caught up in those differences. I think we do ourselves a disservice by getting so caught up in like our human, this is the right way, you know, versus like, here's the land still being destroyed right in front of us. Who's going to do something about it, you know?
All right, thank you for an engaging discussion. My question comes to you you mentioned, so when it comes to climate change justice, there's so much talk about get more people involved, and you say there's a lot of people that already know what to do, right? We got a lot of indigenous groups that have indigenous knowledge about the land and know what to do. So this is my concern. So I'm excited about what different groups have and the knowledges they bring. And as that informs government and policy, in what ways do we prevent their knowledge from being exploited for other uses while protecting the land? And this is something I think about often because I think it's very useful knowledge, but there's this check and balance system where there's some things that are going to get shared with the masses and some things that should be kept sacred. Yeah, I want your opinion on how for us to learn more about traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous people be protected.
Yeah, I actually worked a lot on that in law school, on biopiracy and the theft of traditional knowledge from indigenous peoples around the globe. It's a very real thing. There is a reality that although we might have the best of intentions and we want to share and we want to teach, that not everyone is going to be there to learn. They may be there to exploit, and they may be there with the approach of how do I put oligarchy into this? How do I make a buck off of this? How do I genetically modify your sacred ecological understanding of this specific plant and now patent it and make a fortune off of it to the detriment of your community? And your community continues to suffer in the meantime, and you know, you're underwater now, or the dam gets built, or the mine is right next to your drinking water source. But you know, I got that thing from you. And I think that can be there in movement too, right? Which is like, how do we, although I think it's a little more confusing, right? When you see like a functional community of resistance that's steeped in land, that's steeped in knowledge sharing and skill sharing and principles of equity and inclusivity, I think there's a reality that those words and those buzzwords have been taken by maybe more top-down strategy. You see that in a lot of spaces, but in reality, like they're still not necessarily like exploiting because they don't have those models, right? Like those models require you to actually live out that set of principles. That said, I do think like the funding world is still a very it's reflective of a lot of the systems of injustice that we're trying to address. which is, you know, you got the huge organization that's saying the buzzwords and has some black and brown faces, but is not doing the completely transformational work that's needed. But the little tiny grassroots that has no money is still doing it with or without, you know, like it's still happening. And hopefully they're not fighting each other. Yeah, I don't know if that answered. I'm sorry. I mean, I think there's a way to protect yourself when it comes to traditional knowledge. I wrote a lot about some reform around intellectual property and the idea of community property and protecting it in that way, because the reality of intellectual property is that it exists, and it's like kind of like the question of, like, you know, the state of it still exists, right? The Biden administration still exists. All these things exist around us. So how do we engage in a way that's still protective of our communities? So I thought that that might be a way. Also, in movement, you know, the answer there, I think, is a lot of transformation that's needed from program officers and from folks that can influence these movements to be more powerful, to stop so heavily engaging in top organizing and top-down funding.
Rose, this is Susan Kidd.
Hello, Susan.
your co-worker. So I am supposed to help you wrap up. I think we might have time for one more question if we can see if there's one in the audience or virtually. Does that sound good to y'all?
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Any last question? Last chance? Yes.
Hi. So people talk about how like climate justice isn't represented as much as it should be in media, but obviously like you're very knowledgeable on the topic. So I'm wondering where you get your information or where you suggest people that are interested in climate justice can get information that's reliable. Should we be like reading books or, you know, the New York Times? Just what would be your advice for that?
I mean, I'm probably knowledgeable on climate justice because I live it, right? I would recommend that you try to find Black, Brown, and Indigenous authors, that you look to make sure that those folks are part of a community. I mean, just because that's just part of it too, right? Just because you're a Black or brown face doesn't mean that you necessarily are inside that impacted community, right? And that you are speaking from a knowledgeable standpoint. You could be also kind of like on the outside looking in and pulling from a lot of statistical data and being a voice out in like a different space, but not necessarily really of that community. And those are different things, right? Like I think there's a huge difference between statistical colder language than there is of like, here's the actual climate justice issues that face our community. Here's like the health disparities. Here's like the existing framework of injustice that is now being exacerbated by the chemical plant or by the refinery that's now in our community, by whatever climate injustice happens to be there. I think looking for those voices is really important. It is difficult work, but it's worth it, right? Like, isn't it good to actually hear from the land and the community itself? No one can better speak for themselves than that person, right? Like, than that voice, and not becoming so disconnected. So I think, you know, some groups are doing a better job of that than others, of trying to pull up those voices and find those people. But yeah, it's going to take some work, unfortunately. I'm sorry. I don't have a better answer for you. I wish it was that simple.
No, it's a helpful answer. And I think I'll take Rose's role for a second and get her to reflect on that too, because Rose, one of the things that stands out in your work is the research you do. in advance of any interview, like you did, like we saw in your intro today? What would you add to that?
Well, I'm from the mindset of, knowledge is key. And I always tell people when they ask me about, well, how do I know which news outlet I'm watching is credible? And I say, you know what? Look, you have to make sure you are a good consumer of news. And that means also in doing your research. Um, if you're just going to listen to what somebody puts on Facebook or what Uncle Bob says at every Thanksgiving, you know, um, we have that knowledge. I tell the younger journalists, you all with technology, you all have access to so much. I remember going to the library, looking up the Dewey Decimal System to find some information on a topic. But I also too want to encourage folks to reach out to individuals like Tara. Yeah, you can get some information from a book, or watching a documentary. But if you have access, reach out and talk to people and listen. I think that's one of the problems that we have with all the divisiveness that we have when it comes to finding solutions and working together. People don't listen, and listen to people who are impacted. Stop telling people of color how they should act or feel about something. Listen to them. Your plight is not like mine. So sometimes you just got to stop and listen and absorb the knowledge. And if you're going to be an ally, be an ally. That's all I'm going to say.
I mean, thank you. Thank you for that. And I think both, there's so many takeaways from what you both have said, but this sort of reminder more than once from each of you about empathy and listening, which really for me are coming from the same place of the foundational ways to approach this work. So my job of the moment is to thank you both so much. This has been an incredible, there's been lots of Twitter and note-taking and quote sharing here in the audience and virtually, so we are so grateful for your time. I want to get this audience to thank you, quite literally. There's cheering, in case you can't hear it, all the way to the great north or across town. So, I should say that just like our speakers this morning, these are two very busy people who really slotted us in a thoughtful way, and we're really grateful for your time, both getting ready to be here and for being with us today. So thank you both so much. I hope we'll see you more, and I would even say often at Agnes Scott and connected. We hope we've made a connection that we can keep with both of you. So thank you for all that you do and for your time with us today.